All right, let's jump right in. Today we are digging into a really complex source, a sermon from 1981 by Reverend Sun Myung Moon called The Life Power of Love. Now this text tries to do something huge. First, to define good and evil, and then to offer a single principle that it says can unite these two powerful opposing forces. So, let's get into it.
So right off the bat, the sermon throws this massive philosophical question at us. We live in a world that seems defined by opposites, good versus evil, inside versus outside. So the question is there one single fundamental power out there that's strong enough to bring all of that together? That's the puzzle this text is setting out to solve. Okay, so if you're going to unite two worlds, you've got to define them first, right? That makes sense? The sermon starts by tackling this really foundational problem. How do we actually draw a clear, solid line between what we call good and what we call evil?
And this is where the sermon really draws a line in the sand. It defines good as something that has this unchanging quality. It's constant, it's reliable, and it's always directed toward others. On the other hand, it argues that the single most important characteristic of evil is its changeability. It's fundamentally unreliable and, at its core, self-serving.
And according to the text, this changeability is exactly what makes evil so, well, treacherous. The idea is that because its very nature is to shift and change for its own benefit, you just can't trust it. It might show you one face today and a completely different one tomorrow. Okay, so if evil's main trait is that it's always changing, the next logical question is, where does that come from? And this is the point where the text presents its specific diagnosis, which, especially by today's standards, is a pretty controversial one.
The source material makes this direct, and I mean direct link between this idea of changeability and gender. It suggests that the different natures of men and women are actually central to understanding this whole dynamic between the unchanging and the changeable.
And this is the central analogy the sermon uses to frame that entire argument. The world of men is presented as being like the stable, kind of dull-colored soil. Meanwhile, the world of women is compared to the vibrant, colorful, and constantly changing flowers and plants that grow out of that soil. So let's break this down a bit more. The sermon characterizes women as being more susceptible to change, drawn to new things, new fashions, new colors, like a flower garden, designed to get attention. Men, in this analogy, are the constant, unchanging soil. The text then ties this whole idea directly to the biblical story in Genesis, suggesting that it was Eve, representing this changeable nature, who started the fall.
All right, so after laying out the problem and its diagnosis, this division rooted in changeability, the whole thing pivots. The sermon moves from what's wrong to how to fix it, presenting what it calls the ultimate solution to bring these divided worlds into harmony.
And this is it. This is the big solution the sermon offers, the life power of love. This is the term it uses for the one force that it claims is truly fundamental and, this is the important part, unchanging. It's presented as the absolute standard, the universal constant that can bridge the gap between good and evil, between man and woman and all those other opposites.
Now, a really key part of this life power of love is which way it flows. The sermon is really clear that this love is never, ever self-centered. Its entire point is to be given away, to be aimed at an object. And this, the text says, is why God needed creation in the first place. He needed an other to give his love to. This leads to one of the most memorable phrases in the sermon, that everything, from the tiniest atom all the way up to us, wants to be a prisoner of love. The idea is that all of creation finds its real purpose when it's connected to and kind of captured by this divine love.
But it's one thing to talk about this big abstract principle. How do you actually do it? How does it work in the real world? Well, the sermon moves on to explain how this life power of love isn't just a concept, but a skill you have to practice and perfect through some very specific activities. So the sermon's framework basically reinterprets several Unification Church practices as a kind of practical training, love workshop, if you will. For example, family life is described as the main workshop, but things like fundraising are framed as training to love all the things of creation, and witnessing is seen as training to love all people, even your opponents.
And the sermon takes this idea even further, using a pretty familiar analogy, higher education. It compares these training periods to earning a doctorate degree. The text suggests you have to first get a PhD in loving everything and everyone before you're actually qualified to build your own family, which it calls the ultimate workshop.
So we've had the problem, the solution, and the practical training. The sermon wraps up by painting this picture of the ultimate vision, what the world would look like if all this came to pass.
And the image it uses to describe this final goal is, well, it's pretty evocative. The ultimate goal is a world where people are drunk in God's love. It's this idea of being so totally immersed and satisfied that, according to the text, all the division and conflict would just melt away.
So at the end of the day, the sermon makes this huge claim that the life power of love is the one thing, the one principle that can unify everything. And that really brings us full circle, right back to that first question. Can a single principle truly harmonize two worlds that seem so completely opposed? The text leaves that for us to think about. Thanks so much for watching.